Well, welcome everyone and good afternoon. We are pleased to welcome you all to the Washington Labs Academy webinar series. We hope you find the next hour or so useful and informative. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Greg Shumack. Greg Shumack is a senior TCB reviewer at American Certification Body, also known as ACB. He is a veteran of the wireless regulatory industry, serving for a dozen years at the Equipment Authorization Branch at the Federal Communications Commission. Greg has reviewed thousands of devices for compliance for the FCC and ICIT Canada rules, and is on the board of directors for the Telecommunication Certification Body Council, also known as TCBC. Greg has given lectures and sermons and presentations for a variety of audiences and continues to tackle complex device applications. So, without further ado, let's turn our attention to modular approvals integration of certified modules and the responsibilities of the host manufacturers and installers with Greg Shumack. Hi, Greg.
Hey, Kim, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you everybody for attending. Let me start to share my screen. Okay, Kim, can you see that? And everybody?
Yes, I see it perfectly. If you can put it in.
There we go.
There we go. Perfect.
Perfect. All right. So thank you so much for that introduction, and we'll go ahead and get started. Again, thank you everyone for tuning in this afternoon. We're going to be talking about modular approvals, both from the approval side and then also focusing somewhat on the responsibilities of the integrators or installers or host manufacturers who are going to be using the modules. If you have any questions while I'm going through, you can go ahead and raise your hand and ask, and Kim will direct it to me because in presentation mode, I can't see that myself. And I'm happy to answer the questions as we go along. And then also we'll hopefully have a few minutes at the end where we can take questions as well. If the questions start to build up during the presentation too much, I might at that point ask that we wait until the end just to make sure that we can get through the presentation. So with that, we'll get going. You already received, I think, the introduction from Kim about me. I've been doing this for a very long time. I started in the FCC right out of college and worked in equipment authorization there for almost 13 years. Then I went into the newly formed TCB community in 2000 and have been active in the TCB community ever since then. So we're going to be talking about modules today. Modules have become more popular than ever. You can see here I did a little bit of research and showed going back how many Bluetooth or Wi-Fi type modules were approved in various years in the past. Starting in 2005, you could see there were just a couple of dozen. The big jump came between 2010 and 2015 when it jumped up to 1,400. And in the 8 years from 2015 through the end of 2023, that number doubled, more than doubled once again. Non-radio manufacturers are able to use these modules in their products and take advantage of state-of-the-art communications and wireless communications, regardless of what your particular industry or expertise might be. And certainly IoT proliferation is relying heavily on radio modules. Again, today we're going to be talking specifically about radio module requirements and requirements on installers here in the United States. And so we're going to be talking about the FCC's requirements for these. The FCC introduced modules, or the concept of modules, back in the mid-90s. And the intent from the beginning was to offer relief on the requirement to continually recertify a device that's using the same transmitter circuitry over and over and over again. Over the years, a lot of people took that to mean, or they misunderstood it to be, a relief from the requirement to test the host device once the module is installed. But that's not correct. The FCC has always required a certain subset of spot check type testing to be performed once the module is installed in your host device. However, you do not have to reauthorize your device once you've added that certified module. So you're able to leverage the authorization of the module in your device. But again, it does not excuse you from all testing requirements or other potential requirements necessary to ensure the continuing compliance of the module. When we start talking about modules, there's a couple of different types that we typically look at. The two main types that we look at are full or single modular approvals. And then the second type is limited modular approvals. And I'll speak about those in a moment. But a radio module that's approved for use in any host is a full modular approval. The transmitter is fully assessed to the appropriate FCC rules and the modular approval requirements. It can be used in any environment, in any host, within the scope of the certification parameters and grant conditions for every specific module. Another type of module is what's called a limited modular approval. This is typically approved for specific hosts or specific environments, oftentimes under the control of the module's grantee, the manufacturer of the module, though it does not necessarily have to be. We'll talk a little bit more in detail about these things in the future, but in a few minutes. But generally speaking, if the radio transmitter module doesn't meet all of the approval requirements, it might still be authorized as a limited modular approval. But then there will be extra hoops to jump through to show how it still maintains compliance in all situations. A third type of modular approval that could be either full or limited is what's called a split modular approval. And this is when the module itself is divided into two components. One is the front end with the antenna, and then the transmitter control element, or specific hardware in which the software that controls the radio operation resides. So you're taking a standard module and splitting it up and taking the front end and separating it from the control software. You see a certain amount of these out there in the marketplace, but to be honest, not too many of them. The vast majority of modules that you will see are going to be full modular approvals or limited modular approvals, but not split modules. Now, regardless of the type of module, remember that the module itself is the certified device. When you put a certified module into a host, it does not transfer any type of certification or authorization to that host device. The host device might have other components that require authorization, but that modular certification will only apply to the module, the transmitter module that's put into the device. In addition, it should be noted that just because a device is approved as a module, it does not guarantee that it's going to continue to comply with all of its specific requirements or operating parameters in every single different host device into which it's been installed. And that's one of the reasons why a certain level of spot check testing is always required by the host manufacturer when they're installing even a certified module. So if you look into the FCC rules, you'll find that the modular requirements are specified in section 15.212. That's in part 15C, which is unlicensed intentional radiators. Note that licensed transmitters, things like part 22, 24, 27, your cellular services, LTE, things like of that nature, they may also be certified as modules, but that is based on FCC policy, not a rule, because there is no specific rule that states that licensed transmitters may be authorized as modules. But as a policy, the FCC does allow this to occur, and then requires that for the most part, the licensed module follow the same modular requirements as the unlicensed module, with one exception. We'll get into that in a few minutes, or on the next slide, as a matter of fact, because these are the different modular requirements that a module manufacturer must demonstrate compliance with in order to obtain that modular certification. And these go back, at least the first 5 or 6 of them go back to the very first modular approvals issued by the FCC back in 95 or 96. But these requirements you can see listed here. The transmitter section must have its own shield. And note that the reason for that is not just to contain spurious emissions within the module, but an equally important reason is because you want to be able to protect the module from influence of other strong fields in the device in which you're installing the module. And certainly have seen many situations over the years where a module is installed next to a large power supply that's creating heavy magnetic fields that have actually dragged the tuning of the module off, and so that it was transmitting not on its intended channel, but was off by, in some cases, many kilohertz off. And so that shield is there to protect the module, as well as to keep any spurious radiation from being emitted into the atmosphere. There must be buffered modulation in data inputs. You must have power supply regulation. You must meet the antenna connector requirements. And this is the one that I was mentioning that is not always the case for licensed transmitters, because licensed transmitters do not have the same level of antenna connector requirements that unlicensed transmitters do. Continuing, it must be tested in a standalone configuration. It's not supposed to be tested already installed in a host, because you're supposed to be able to show that a full module is capable of compliance even without a host device around it. The module itself must be labeled with its FCC ID number. It must meet its own specific rules and requirements, depending on what section you are authorizing the module under. For example, a Bluetooth module is going to have to meet all of the required Bluetooth requirements when it comes to channel spacing, channel bandwidths, and things of that nature. And then finally, modules must also always address and meet the RF exposure requirements that we have for all transmitters. And that's something that must be addressed pretty much all the time now. So some of the other requirements that are incumbent upon module manufacturers is to inform their customers, the installers and the people who are buying the modules and intending to install them, of what specific requirements they are supposed to follow. One of them is that the host device must be labeled in a way that shows the presence of the module within it. And that's typically by putting somewhere on the host device a label that contains the text, contains TX FCC ID, and then whatever the ID number is of the module itself. And remember, that is the ID number of the module. It does not become the ID number of the host. It is the ID number of the module. And you can see in the example here where it shows contains FCC ID, and then I blanked those out, but that's where you would put the FCC. And if this is an ISED module as well, the ISED IC ID number would be placed on the label also. Another requirement that module manufacturers have is they must provide clear installation and usage instructions to the installer. These are specified in some of the publications that the FCC puts out, and we'll be talking about those shortly. But one of the things that a TCB must do when they're reviewing an application for a module is to ensure that all of the proper information to the installer is included there in the installation guide or the other documentation that's provided by the module manufacturer to their customers. The installer must be instructed on the conditions of use, including minimum separation distances required for RF exposure compliance. The installer must be informed about the required labeling on the host that we just spoke about. There are certain users manuals disclosures. The module manufacturer must inform the installer of what that information is that must be passed along to the end user by being put in the host device's user's manual. And the module manufacturer is supposed to tell the host installer that further testing will be necessary at the final system level to ensure that the module continues to comply once installed in your particular host device. Now, those 8 criteria that we had on the slide before last, if the module is not capable of meeting all of those 8 criteria, that's when it may obtain a limited modular approval. And oftentimes that's going to be limited to a specific host or usage configuration. The reason is, let me go back to that slide real quick. If, for example, your module does not have buffered modulation or data inputs, but you know that you're only going to be using this module in certain types of devices that have very controlled data that will be going into the module, then you might be able to obtain a limited modular approval. That means that even though there is no buffered modulation or data inputs, compliance can still be demonstrated by controlling the host devices into which this module is installed. And so that's why oftentimes a limited modular approval is actually approved for a specific host device.
Greg, you have a few questions. Did you want to stop here or
Sure,
did you want to?
sure.
Okay.
Yeah, we can stop and I'll take them.
Okay, so I do see two questions here, and I see a hand raised, and that hand raised of the attendee also a chat a question, so I'm hoping it's the same thing. So
Okay.
let me know if it's not. First question is, what are the differences between licensed and unlicensed modules?
Okay. What the difference is this: we're talking primarily about transmitters, a licensed transmitter or an unlicensed transmitter. A licensed transmitter is something that's used typically with a licensed service. For instance, cellular or all of the PCS, all of your um, last mile point to point type services, all of the different radio services that are out there. Those transmitters are referred to as licensed transmitters. They typically have higher output power limitations, so you're allowed to have more power. They are oftentimes channelized, and they always require a site license or usage license. Now, in the case of your smartphone, for example, if you've got a Verizon smartphone, Verizon holds a license, and it's an umbrella license that covers the usage of all of the handsets that are on its system. But the FCC, in addition to the equipment authorization, also has the licensing requirement. And that's an added level of control that the FCC can continue to maintain over the licensed services and the licensed transmitters that are used in those services. An unlicensed transmitter or module, or often referred to as a Part 15 transmitter, because they're all in Part 15 of the rules, does not require any licensing to use it. Once the equipment is authorized, it may be marketed and used by anybody in accordance with, there might be certain specific requirements for that piece of equipment, but there is no site licensing or any further licensing requirement for an unlicensed transmitter. The downside, though, is that they tend to operate at much, much lower output power levels. So your smartphone contains, for example, a combination of licensed and unlicensed transmitters. The licensed transmitter might be the cellular, the GSM, the wide CDMA, the LTE. Those things that are all running through the carrier network are the licensed transmitters in your smartphone. But your Wi-Fi and your Bluetooth and your RFID, for example, that many people have in their smartphones, those are all unlicensed transmitters. They don't operate on a network. They don't require a license for operation, but they have considerably lower power. So I hope that answers that question.
Okay, thank you. And the last question I see at the moment is, what is the meaning of buffered modulation data in
Oh, okay.
outs?
So the reason, and I was actually involved in that because I was there at the time, a lot of the early modules were little simple FM transmitters. And if you don't put any modulation on the input of an FM transmitter, if you guys think back to your physics or beginning engineering, the greater the volume into a microphone that's being that's going to be transmitting audio using FM, the greater the volume on the input, the wider the deviation of the signal. And so if you yell into the microphone, the signal might go from 10 kilohertz wide to 50 kilohertz wide. And step all over and go out of band and step on other people's channels and all of that. And so that original requirement was to make sure that there was buffering on the data inputs so that if a high level data input came in, it didn't drive the transmitter to produce an output that was out of spec. Granted, most of that doesn't really come into play with the modern digital transmission formats that are being used. It was really something that was taking care of FM transmission, but there are still to this day FM modules that are being created and used. And so that's why that requirement stays in place.
Okay, thank you. There's another question, but we'll wait for a little while and I'll get back to that. Or did you want me to ask it?
Go ahead and ask it. We'll do it now.
Can transmitters operating per UWB protocols be evaluated as a module? And are
Yes.
there any unique requirements for UWB modules if
Yes.
permitted?
Yeah, that can be. And the key there is that there is one specific section in 15F, which is the part that covers ultra wideband. There's one specific section that under which ultra wideband modules can be authorized. And I'm working from memory, so I might not be right on this. So don't quote me, but it might be 15.519, I believe. But it's the section that's for small handheld devices, and it's also applicable to modules. So yes, you can get that approved there. There are certain operating requirements for any ultra wideband device going under that section, whether a module or not. And so you will have to demonstrate compliance with those specific operating requirements in that section. Again, I think it's 15.519. So there would be some specific requirements for that based on whatever those rules are. But the overall answer is yes, you can definitely get an ultra wideband device approved as a module.
Okay, thank you. No other questions at this time.
Okay, so let's see, where were we? Okay, so this is what I was talking about for a limited modular approval. The grant is going to specify, the grant of authorization will specify whatever the marketing, the installation, or the usage limitations might be in order to ensure that that grant is still going to be compliant when it's used in a particular host device. And ultimately, the module's grantee remains responsible for the module's compliance in all hosts devices. So the module's grantee never gives up that responsibility. However, the host device manufacturer, the person who's installing the module, shares in that responsibility. And in the case of an interference complaint, the way the FCC handles it with modules is they begin with the premise that the module grantee and the host manufacturer are equally responsible for the interference that's being caused. And then at that point, they will begin to dig into the details. And the details might show that it is either the module grantee or the host manufacturer who is more responsible, or it might be both. The grantee might be responsible because they failed to provide the necessary instructions to the host manufacturer in order to get the module installed and operating in a compliant manner. Or it could be that the host manufacturer received those instructions and yet chose to ignore them and did not follow the instructions provided by the module grantee, installed and is using the module in a manner that was not recommended or specified. And so maybe the interference is their fault. And so the FCC will dig more into it to try and determine the actual situation. But it always starts out on the premise that both the module grantee and the host manufacturer are equally responsible for any interference caused or for the continuing compliance of the module inside the host. As I said earlier, they're typically authorized in specific hosts or a series of hosts that are either similar or identical in construction. If that's the case, if it's authorized for use in a specific host or series of hosts, then those are the only hosts in which you can put them. If you wanted to add a different type of host, the module manufacturer would have to then file a permissive change, a class 2 permissive change, to add a new host to their limited module approval. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the LMA is typically not tested standalone. If it's not complying with one of those requirements and it's going to rely on the host to either provide good input or regulated power input or shielding to keep the spurious emissions down, whatever the case might be. So typically a limited modular approval will be tested in a host device, and then it's going to be approved for use in that specific host or in similar hosts. Dissimilar hosts will require additional testing. Now, if you look at the actual authorization for a modular approval, regardless of whether it's full or limited, you're going to get a lot of information from that grant of authorization. First of all, you will learn if it's full or limited and if it's a split module or not. If it is a limited modular approval, then the grant of authorization should specify what aspect of it is limited. In other words, it might say something along the lines of, this module is only approved for use in hosts that are manufactured by the grantee of the module, or only approved for use in hosts in which the module manufacturer has direct control over the installation, or it might be other types of devices in which the device might be only approved for use in devices that can be used indoors, depending on the requirements of the specific module. So you would be able to look at the authorization of the module for a limited modular approval. And as an installer, you would be able to see what limitations are on that module. In that way, you can ensure that the way that you intend to use it or desire to use the module is something that's within the parameters of authorized use for that module. Now, in addition, when a host manufacturer purchases modules from a module manufacturer, you should also be getting installation instructions. And that installation guide should clearly explain any specific conditions required for the module's ongoing compliance, as well as any further actions required of the installer or the host manufacturer. Now, one particular condition that you see on a lot, especially of the older grants, but some TCBs are still putting this out on modules to this day, is you'll see a condition that says something about this device may not be co-located with other transmitters, no co-location in one form or another. That's not really accurate. That is older language, and the FCC has instructed the TCBs that we shouldn't be using that language anymore, but some TCBs will still use it. And if you're purchasing a module that maybe was approved 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, it might actually still have that language on the grant. Please realize that that is not really, it doesn't merely mean what it says, because the concern is not that you have two modules. Maybe you have a host device that you're creating and you want to put a Bluetooth Wi-Fi module in it, and you want to put an LTE module so it can get on a network, and then it also has Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. You are allowed to put those two modules into your device. You can co-locate them, because the issue is truly not co-location, but rather simultaneous transmission of those co-located transmitters. So if you have a situation where you put two modules into your device, but only one can operate at a time, then it's a non-issue. There's no problem with co-locating them because only one transmits at a time. Now, if they can transmit simultaneously, you still may be able to do it. However, you will have to take some steps to ensure that the simultaneous transmission remains compliant with the FCC rules. And that comes into some of the spot check testing that we'll be talking about in just a few minutes. But that is the true issue. There is the fact that if there is the potential for simultaneous transmission, then that must be addressed. And the current grant language that's been specified by the FCC is similar to something like this. The antennas used for this transmitter must not transmit simultaneously with any other antenna or transmitter, except in accordance with FCC multi-transmitter product procedures. The grantee, and in this case, that means the module manufacturer, the module grantee, must provide installation and operating instructions for complying with FCC multi-transmitter product procedures. And so if you have bought a module and you see on its grant something about no co-location, you don't need to panic. The real concern is co-transmission. And even then, it doesn't mean that it cannot be done. It just means that it must be addressed properly.
Greg, I have oh, sorry.
Okay, go ahead. More questions?
Yes, more questions. I'm not sure if I'm being rude, interrupting, or how you want me
to. No, that's fine. Okay. Please do.
All right, so I have a raised hand, and then I have some questions in the chat, and I've never done the raised hand. So I'm going to read out a question from the chat. And while I do that, I'm going to go ahead and prepare to unmute the raised hand. Okay.
Okay.
Two different attendees. So the question is, does the conformity statement, also the SDOT, does it need to be signed?
The conformity. Okay. So this is, I guess, on one of these previous slides here. Conformity. Okay. I'm not quite sure what we're talking about. Maybe you can unmute that person and they can explain what they meant.
I'll get to that next. I did unmute the raised hand
of
the first one. However, that question again, just in case I didn't read it right, was pretty much, does the SDOT, does it need to be signed? But I'll unmute.
Does an SDOT need to be signed?
Yes.
I think so. I'd have to go back and check in the rules. I haven't looked at that recently, but I suspect that that's the case. In part 2 of the rules, There's a whole section on the requirements on the supplier's declaration of conformity. For those of you that aren't aware, that's what the SDOC stands for. And in part 2 of the FCC rules, there's sections that cover all of the requirements for SDOCs. I suspect that it has to be signed, but to be honest with you, I don't remember that off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you. And Daniel Ding, I'm sorry if I pronounced the last name wrong. You have the ability to go ahead and unmute and ask your question since your hand was raised.
Daniel, if you wanted to unmute and ask your question.
All right, I will move on. I do see a question from him in the chat, so maybe that's what he wanted
Okay.
me to get down. So let me go to that question from Daniel.
Okay.
His question is how to handle FCC ISIT certifications on a module that has DFS master. Sorry, another question came in, so I lost my place.
Okay. Yeah.
So how to handle a FCC ISIT certification on a module that has DFS master capability? Should full module or limited module be applied to? Thanks.
And again, you know what, what we can do, Kim, is I would have to go back and look up that specific requirement. There's a lot of requirements. It's hard to remember all of them. So, but that's certainly something we can look up and provide a response in the next day or so. I can definitely look that up and give you an answer to that. I know that for master DFS, at one time in the past, you were not even permitted to obtain a modular approval for a master DFS. Now, I think that that has probably changed in more recent years. But as far as the details go, I'd have to go up and look up the details myself. So that's any of these questions that I can't answer right now off the top of my head. We will definitely in the next day or so send you responses to them.
Okay. So Daniel, I'm going to go ahead and drop your hand. If that was not the question, please raise it again and I'll get back to you in queue. The next question is if limited modular approved module is used in the medical device, does medical device needs to be tested to FCC Part 15? Because medical device is exempt from FCC Part 15. Perhaps the host medical device does not need to be tested and filed for Class 2 permissive change to the grant of the limited modular approved module?
That's a good question. So it really kind of depends on the exact circumstances. Generally speaking, a medical device would not necessarily have to get Part 15, although a lot of companies have been requiring that in any event. So a lot of people are still getting that Part 15 for their medical devices, even if it's not required. But generally speaking, if you're going to be using a module in a medical device, you want to make sure that you're using a certified module, first of all. And then when you put it in the device, you will not have to recertify it to Part 15. However, you still will have to perform a limited number of spot check tests on that. And again, we're going to be talking about that a little bit later, but you have to perform some spot check testing on that module once it's installed in your device, in this case, a medical device, just to ensure that the module continues to be compliant. So you're not testing the medical device, so to speak, but you're testing the module while it's installed and operating in the medical device. So I hope that answers that question.
All right, I'm going to read the next chat and then I'm going to prepare to unmute for the next raised hand.
Okay.
Okay, let's see. I've noticed that some host devices do not have FCC ID for module labeled on the host level device. They only are labeled with the FCC logo, and they also don't have the FCC ID labeled in their instructions for use. Are there specific situations in which this is allowed?
No, that is the host device manufacturer not doing what they are supposed to do. The rules are very clear that when you're using a certified module in your device, you have to put a label on it. Now, it could be an electronic label. E-labeling is permitted if the device has a screen, and you can come up with an e-label, but you still must show that it contains TX FCC ID. You must show the presence of the transmitter module inside the device on a label. Again, it could be a physical label or it could be an electronic label on a screen. if you're using and leveraging the certification of a module, you must indicate that on the outside of the device. So if you do see host manufacturers that don't list the ID number of the contained module, that's a mistake that they are making, that they are not labeling their device properly. I don't know that the FCC would necessarily fine them for that or anything like that, but certainly if the FCC were asked about it, they would say, no, this is not correct. You are required to put that label on the host device.
Okay, Greg, I have one chat who is ready to go. I'm sorry, one raised hand who has who's able to speak, and then I have two questions after that. How do you like me to proceed?
Well, let's go with the raised hand.
Okay, you, Sababa, I'm so sorry if I said the name wrong. You're unmuted.
Uh, my question is, if a device has a two module, one for Wi-Fi Bluetooth and one for cellular module, and Wi-Fi modular certificate mentioned that it should not operate a co-location. So after the integration into a host product, if the host product complies with the simultaneous transmission requirement, does it require to have a class 2 permissive change certification for the host device?
No, no. Again, that's because that no co-location is not really the correct language. So you've got your Wi-Fi Bluetooth module and you got your cellular module. You put them both in your device. You perform some testing with them both transmitting simultaneously to make sure that there are no issues with that. And again, we will talk a little bit about that testing shortly. But then you're good to go. There's no need to do a permissive change on the module in that situation. There are times when you would want to do a permissive change on a module, and I think I'm going to be getting to that in the next slide or two.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
All right, Greg, one last question and then you can proceed.
Okay.
If an integrated device has a motor, does normal operation require the motor to be spinning?
Yeah. First, we have to realize that motors are classified as incidental radiators by the FCC. And if you're going to get a lot of, like, if it's a classic motor, you're going to get a lot of brush noise. And that's going to probably make it so you can't even make decent measurements depending on the motor. So typically, no. You can do a measurement with the motor spinning, with the motor running. But again, if you're seeing lots of brush noise everywhere and it's keeping you from making any real measurements other than that, then I would say turn the motor off and do a measurement with the motor off as well, because the emissions from the motor do not have any, they do not have to comply with any limits. That's considered incidental radiation. And so that those brushes, the noise that comes off of those brushes, those do not have to meet any limits. But obviously the emissions from the transmitter do. So in that case, it would probably make more sense to have the motor turned off so you can make sure that you can see anything potentially coming from the transmitter. Does that make sense?
Yep, I believe so.
Oh,
They'll
okay,
let me
that's
know
right.
if it
That's
doesn't.
right.
But thank you, and no additional questions. Please proceed. Thank you.
Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the other grant conditions that we see, and these have to do with RF exposure compliance. The vast majority of modules are authorized as mobile devices with respect to RF exposure compliance. And a mobile device means it's operated at more than 20 centimeters from the person. And so the vast majority of modules are authorized for that, in that type of classification for RF exposure. Now, if it was authorized as a mobile device with that 20 centimeter spacing requirement, it is possible to use it at a closer distance. But in that case, you would have to perform SAR testing on the device in the host at that closer distance. And in that case, a class 2 permissive change would be required for the module in order to authorize it in a specific portable host, portable meaning for use less than 20 centimeters away. And when you have a portable device for RF exposure, you have to perform SAR testing on it, which is pretty involved and very expensive to ensure that the RF radiation is not going to be harming human tissue. So for a portable device, you would have to normally perform that SAR testing. But if the module was approved as a mobile device, then you would need to, the module manufacturer would need to perform a Class 2 permissive change and authorize their module in a specific portable host, in which case there would be SAR testing to demonstrate the compliance of the module when it's being used closer than 20 centimeters. So that's a situation where you would typically do a Class 2 permissive change on the modules when you're changing its RF exposure criteria from mobile to portable, because that portable testing, as I said, is much more involved and it only applies when the device is going to be used close to the human body. Other grant conditions that we might see on the grant have to do with the limited modular approval, and we've already talked about these a fair amount. So for example, if it doesn't have a shield and it's tested in the host, then that specific host is listed on the grant remarks. It will say something like, this module is only approved for use when it's installed in host XYZ as specified in the filing. So again, looking at the grants for these modular approvals is very important, because you will get all of the different type of usage limitations that might exist for that particular device. The information that must be provided to the installer is specified in this KDB publication of the FCC. And at the end of this presentation, I have the links for all of these things. But 996369 document 03 provides the specific information that the module manufacturer must provide to the installer. And then TCBs, when we authorize these modular approval applications, we have to check and make sure that they're showing us that they know what information has to be provided. The information that is to be provided, you can see here in the KDB publication. It states that when integrating a module in a host product, the modular transmitter applicant should include information in their instructions, clearly indicating if certain things are applicable or not applicable. For example, information on trace antenna design should indicate not applicable unless the module is authorized for use with a trace antenna. So many modules will be authorized with an antenna trace, which means that in your host device, you've got to lay out and put a trace antenna somewhere on the board of your PCB. So if that's the case, then the module manufacturer has to provide you with all of the detailed information about the specifics of that trace antenna to make sure that it's installed properly and you guys put it properly on your PCB. If the modular transmitter is only approved for use by the grantee in its own products, then in that case, in the applications, they don't have to provide all the same level of integration instructions that they would if they're intent on selling their products to the general public or to general installers. So again, this is what I was just talking about. The TCB is required to review these and make sure that everything that's being provided to the installer is appropriate and applicable for the actual device. And the reason that comes up is, sometimes these module manufacturers in their rush might have the wrong instructions for a device or things like that. And so that's something that we always want to check and make sure that hopefully they're always going to be providing the proper information along with their modules. This here is the list of information that an installer should receive from the module manufacturer when they're purchasing their modules. The list of the applicable rules, the summary of the specific operational use conditions, any limited module procedures, if you're using a trace antenna, any trace antenna designs, any specifications requiring the required antennas that must be used with the module, label and compliance information. That's information that might be put in the host device's user's manual for the end user to read. Information on the test modes and additional testing requirements. And that's some of that spot check testing that we'll be talking about momentarily. And then a final disclaimer, not final, but a disclaimer that the certification is only applicable to the module. So if the host device has other aspects of it that also require authorization, then the host manufacturer is responsible for getting those aspects of their device authorized. The module's authorization does not transfer to the host. It only stays with the module. And then finally, the module manufacturer must provide the installers with RF exposure information on compliance with RF exposure requirements. So again, this is an example. Most modules are certified as mobile devices used more than 20 centimeters from the body. And that means that the installer must be made aware of this requirement. The module manufacturer has to let the installer know that, hey, this device is only authorized for use more than 20 centimeters away from all persons. So when you're installing it in your host devices, you have to make sure that that's going to remain applicable. And then ultimately, the end user must also be informed of this, that in order to comply with FCC RF exposure compliance requirements, this device must be used such that a minimum 20 centimeter separation distance is always maintained between the antenna and any user. So all of that information about RF exposure compliance starts with the module manufacturer or grantee, has to be passed along to the installer, and then the installer or the host manufacturer must then pass along that information to the end user as well. And so that chain of information that must be passed along is originated by the module manufacturer. Now, it is possible to certify your module as a portable device used within 20 centimeters of the body, but in almost every case where that's done, it's always a limited modular approval because it's going to be limited to the specific host device that's going to be used close to the body. And the reason is it's very, very difficult to perform SAR testing on a naked module. SAR tests are designed to be measuring things like smartphones and things that you might wear on your belt and walkie-talkies and things like that that are close to the human body and putting out RF. And so it's pretty uncommon to see a portable module as its original authorization. The only time that happens is when they know that it's only going to be used in a specific type of host, and so they get it approved as a portable device in that portable host. Generally speaking, when host device manufacturers buy modules, almost always the modules that you purchase are going to be authorized as mobile devices and not portable. But finally, if you have bought a module and it's authorized as a mobile device, but your host is portable, it's going to be used within 20 centimeters of the person, it's still possible for you to use that module, but there's going to be some additional hoops to jump through. If the module is extremely low power, you might meet the SAR test exclusion requirements that are specified in the FCC rules, in which case you don't have to test it for SAR whatsoever, and you can use that module in a portable device. More often, what's the case is that if you bought a module and it's authorized as a mobile device and you want to use it in a portable configuration in your host, you're going to have to take your host device with that module installed and get it SAR tested. And then the module manufacturer will perform a Class 2 permissive change to add that host device as a new possible portable host device for that mobile module. And finally, on RF exposure, it used to be the case that if you were a host manufacturer and you were putting modules into your device, you needed at least one of those modules had to always perform a permissive change to show your host as a possible host device. That's no longer the case. The only time that you would have to perform a permissive change is, like I said, if you're changing your RF exposure condition from mobile to portable. But other than that, as a installer or host manufacturer, if you can put the modules into your device, multiple modules into your device, test it and show that they all comply when running simultaneously, then, and you're not making any changes to the modules and you're following all the modules requirements, then there's no need for you to inform the FCC about anything whatsoever. You simply keep all of that data on file for your host device.
Greg, I have questions on the RF exposure. Do you want to take them now, or do you want to now at this point hold questions?
I want to hold because I know we're kind of getting short on time already, and I really wanted to get into this next section here, which was some specific guidance for host product manufacturers. And I also wanted to say that I'm happy to answer any of the RF exposure questions. If we can't do it live, then we email them in and we can answer them and get those responses back to you in the next day or two. But I was purposely glossing over a lot of that just because the focus here is more on the modules and not on the RF exposure, but certainly I'm happy to answer those questions. But let's go through this a little bit further here. And I'll try and go quickly at this point, so to leave some time for some more questions at the end. In publication 996369 DO4 this time, DO3 was the one that we were looking at before, and that's the information for the module manufacturer. DO4 is the guidance for the host product manufacturers. So host product manufacturers are responsible to follow the integration guidance and to perform a limited set of transmitter module verification testing to ensure that the end product, which is the host with the module installed, remains in compliance with the FCC rules. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, host product manufacturers are responsible for any additional equipment authorization and testing requirements for their host device other than the module, because the module does not convey its certification to the host. If there's any needed certification for the host, that must be done separately from the module. And then moving forward, there's a bunch of requirements here that host manufacturers have to meet. It's strongly recommended that host manufacturers using a certified module address these following items. And there's, I don't remember, 7 or 8 of them that we'll go through now quickly. First of all, you have to account for all FCC compliance requirements. In other words, you have to make sure that all of the devices in the host device have the proper authorization and not just the transmitter module. You also have to consider that if there's digital components, digital circuitry in your host device, that could be a separate authorization that's required. So you have to make sure that all of the different requirements are going to be covered for your host device when you have a module installed. You have to review the integration instructions provided by the module manufacturer and ensure that when you're installing that module in your host device, you're addressing all of the items or all of the specifics that the module manufacturer has provided for in their detailed integration instructions. If the module is authorized as a limited module, then for full compliance, the integration instructions must be followed to ensure that the conditions that limited the original module are clearly being addressed in the host device. If the instructions are inadequate, the integrator must work with the module grantee to address the issues. And so one thing I can say to all host manufacturers, if you're buying modules and want to install modules in your device, don't hesitate to go to the module manufacturer that you're paying money to and say, look, I need detailed instructions. I need this, I need that in order for my device to continue to comply, because those module manufacturers are required to be providing you with all of that information. As the host manufacturer, you have to confirm that the integration instructions for RF exposure requirements are being followed. And that might be the 20 centimeter, for example, minimum separation distance. It's also possible for higher powered modules that minimum separation distance might exceed 20 centimeters. It might be 50 centimeters or something like that, in which case, again, that's information that has to be passed on from the module manufacturer to the host manufacturer. The host manufacturer has to ensure that their device is going to comply with that requirement when the module is installed, and then they're going to have to pass that information along to the end user. Again, the host manufacturer must obtain the required equipment authorization for the unintentional radiator functions. That's the receivers and digital equipment that exists inside your device. You have to label the product appropriately, and that there's a reference to a KDB publication that has all the labeling requirements, but essentially it's the label that says contains TX FCC ID and then the ID number of that transmitter module. You have to perform testing on the product with the transmitter or transmitters operating, those are the module or modules that you're using, to confirm that the host product meets the FCC requirements. Verifying a transmitter by testing for spurious emissions is necessary, even if only one module is installed in the host. So even if you just got one module, you still have to test it to make sure that it continues to comply. This investigation of the final product can be done by spot checking emissions from the device while operating the host as a composite system, which means that all the transmitters are operating that can operate simultaneously are operating simultaneously. This testing is performed with the host product configured in typical operational modes to check the fundamental frequency and spurious emissions for compliance with all of the applicable rules. So please note that if the integration instructions do not contain clear directions for limited modules or for RF exposure compliance, the host product must contact the module manufacturer and obtain that information. So anyway, going back, that was the information on the spot check testing. We'll talk a little bit more about that momentarily. But if any of those preceding items that we just talked about are not resolved, then the host product manufacturer has various options depending on the situation. So if some of these things are not resolved, for example, if the module is authorized as a limited module due to some reason, like it needs buffered input or a buffered power supply, a regulated power supply input. If your host device does not have a regulated power supply that it can provide to the module, then you might need to work with that module manufacturer to ensure that whatever you end up doing is going to still somehow ensure that compliance is met when the device is installed in your device. So you might need to request that the module manufacturer file a permissive change to address the issue. It could be that the host product manufacturer could follow a process by which you're going to reauthorize the module under your own ID number, which means that you become responsible for that module and you can make changes to it as you see fit. And there's a process for that. Or you can file for a new ID to cover your host device and include the modular transmitter as part of that authorization. In other words, you are no longer leveraging the module certification, but rather recertifying the whole device with the module as a part of the device. So these are just various options that you might be able to follow as you're trying to make sure that you address all of the requirements that you need to address to ensure compliance of the module when installed in your host device. Testing the host product with all of the transmitters installed, which is referred to as the composite investigation test, is recommended to verify that the host product meets all of the rules. The radio spectrum to be investigated with all the transmitters in the final host product functioning to determine that no emissions exceed the highest limit permitted for any one individual transmitter is required by this particular section of the FCC rule. So this is where the requirement comes in that says, if you have multiple transmitters, you have to make sure that they're all transmitting simultaneously to ensure that it's not causing any one of them to operate outside of its rules or operating parameters. Now, a formal application for certification submission containing the results of your spot check tests is not required. The host manufacturer is responsible to ensure that when their product operates as intended, it does not have any emissions present that are out of compliance that were not present when the transmitters were tested individually. If the host product uses any transmitters that have not been FCC certified as modular transmitters, then you must obtain certification for those transmitters. But essentially, when you are leveraging the certification of the modules, once you perform the spot check testing, if everything is compliant and you're complying with all those other requirements, there is no submittal to the FCC. You simply keep all of that data on file in case there's ever a complaint in the future. And complaints occur primarily when competitors report each other to the FCC. So you might have a competitor who says, hey, they've got a composite device, or they've got a device here and it's got a module in it and they don't have a label on it or something like that. They might complain to the FCC about that and make the FCC investigate it. So generally speaking, you want to make sure that you keep all of the information on file in case the FCC ever comes and asks you a question about it. When testing the host product, all the transmitters must be operating. The transmitters can be enabled by using publicly available drivers and turned on so that they're active. In some situations, if you're testing like a licensed transmitter, like a cellular transmitter module, it might be necessary to obtain a call box or with the lab that you're using to do the testing, to use a call box in order to engage that licensed transmitter and make sure that it's active and testable. You don't necessarily have to establish communication links with all of your embedded transmitters with another device. Just having them on and running is typically sufficient. They don't have to be in an actual link with another device while this testing is being provided. In order to determine the appropriate test plan, that is the appropriate the modes and channels of operation and specific emissions to be measured, the host product manufacturer should review the modular transmitters test reports that are publicly available on the FCC website. And just as a quick aside, ACB, the company that I work for, one of the services that we provide is an engineering research service where we will, if you come and say, we have a certain device and we want to use this module, FCC ID XYZ, in our device, we at ACB have a service where we will go through the module's test reports and develop an appropriate test plan that you can use to spot check the module in your device. The reason it's oftentimes handy to have a test plan is if you go to a test lab and say, I need you to spot check this module, how much is it going to cost? You might get a response of, say, $3,000. You might go to a second lab and say, I want you to spot check this module for me. How much will it cost? And they'll say, oh, well, to be sure, you're going to need to do $10,000 worth of testing. So how do you know, as a product manufacturer, host product manufacturer, which one of those is correct? They might both be acting in good faith, but one might just think that a lot more testing is necessary in order to perform the spot checks. So what makes things a lot easier for you to compare, if you want to compare one lab to another, is if you already have a test plan, you can take that test plan to the lab and say, how much will it cost for you to perform this test plan? You can then take that same test plan to a different lab, do the same thing, and then you will at least be able to compare apples to apples, and you'll know what the appropriate testing is, not too much, not too little. And we at ACB, we're not a test lab, so we don't have anything, we don't stand to gain by making you do more testing than you need to do. So that's why a fair amount of people will take us up on this particular service. And that's just an aside I wanted to mention there. But certainly if during the testing you find that you've got emissions that are close to the limit or even exceeding the limit, it will be necessary for the host product manufacturer to work with the module manufacturer and investigate and determine why it is that when the module, which complies when it's standalone, seems to fail when it's put into your host device. And so that's a place where the host manufacturer and module manufacturer would want to work together in order to make that a compliant situation. Finally, if the host product manufacturer finds that your composite system, your host product and your modular transmitter, exceeds the spurious emission limits or output power limits, then it's the responsibility of the host product manufacturer not to market that composite product in the United States until such time as you can resolve that non-compliance with the module manufacturer. But if you know that your product, that the module is failing when it's installed in your device, then it's your responsibility not to market that device until the problem is addressed. And that's a case certainly where the host manufacturer and the module manufacturer should be working together to ensure that compliance. Finishing up here real quickly, I've got, and I believe that you guys will all have access to this presentation. So I've got various links here to the different KDB publications and other KDB publications for the modules, for labeling, RF exposure, and the rest. And there's my contact information at the end. So thank you all so much. And I will go ahead now, Kim, if people want to go ahead and give us any more questions. I don't know if people are still hanging on or still about, but if so, I'm happy to answer any additional questions at this time.
Okay, we got a few in the chat. And before I begin, that is correct, Greg. Yes, everyone who has registered, so even for those who could not attend today, everyone who has registered will receive a copy of the recorded webinar along with the presentation slides. I usually try to turn that around a week from today, so most likely next Thursday. If for some reason you haven't received it by the following Monday, please just send an email letting me know you did not get it. But yeah, normally within like a week, I kind of turn that around.
Okay.
All right.
And I've got the chat. I stopped sharing so I can look at the chat now. So
okay, so good. So we
okay.
left off with Michael.
What was the timestamp on?
I can give you that. It was 1:40 p.m.
140, Michael. Okay. How is the minimum separation distance determined? Separation distance from all body parts. Okay. So, okay. For the minimum separation is determined. It depends on the type of device. If it's a small handheld device, like a smartphone, for example, or something like that, it's from the outer edge of the device to the closest point on the person. So a smartphone is going to be 0 separation distance because you're holding it in your hand, for example. But if you have something sitting on your desk It would be from the outer edge, the closest point of the outer edge of the device to where the person is sitting. For a larger type device where, you might be able to clearly see where the antenna is, then you would measure that minimum separation distance typically from the antenna to the person. And that's, for a larger device or something where you can see the antenna. Okay, then let's see, does it have to be impossible to get within 20 centimeters? No, it's normal operation. The 20 centimeter requirement is a requirement that says under normal operation, people are at least 20 centimeters away. So obviously somebody can misuse a device. You can take a cell phone and carry it around in your mouth, holding it with your teeth. And you're probably going to suffer some, if you do that a lot, you're probably going to get some ill side effects from that, but that's not normal operation. And the smartphone manufacturer is not responsible for somebody walking around with a smartphone in their mouth, for example. So it really comes down to normal operation, but I should put a caveat on that. It's normal operation, but again, when we're dealing with RF exposure, this is human safety. And so you always want to err on the side of caution. And then how's it determine separation from all body part? Okay, during normal use, does it have to be impossible? We did that one. Example of product that uses a certified mobile module. A Wi-Fi, a router could use a Wi-Fi module in there, for example, and a router just sits somewhere on a wall or on a shelf somewhere, something like that. Another mobile device, lots of industrial types of things where you've got, maybe transmitter tags on pieces of equipment and things like that in an industrial type of setting, or a manufacturing type of setting, or a warehouse type of setting when you got tags on boxes all through a warehouse, and that allow you to find different products quickly. So those are examples of mobile devices where it's more than 20 centimeters from the body, like a wireless modem, like the next one on there. Yes, exactly. Okay, I have another question. Can a module be certified as a master and client at the same time? It can be, a module may be certified as a master device in certain bands and a client device in other bands. So for example, if you're a master device, if you're operating in the uni 5 gigahertz bands, for some of those bands there, if you're a master device, you have to be able to do DFS testing and things like that. And a lot of people don't want to do that. And so they disable the master function in those specific bands, but enable it to act as a master in other bands. The primary thing that the way the FCC defines a master versus a client is a master can initiate transmissions, whereas a client is only going to be responding to transmission emissions, or operating in a system where it's told when to and controlled when to transmit. So the answer to that is yes, it can be authorized as both, but it would be per band. So some bands would be authorized potentially as a master device, and other bands as a client device. Client devices per 202. Does it mean the module need to be tested with the master requirements? Again, if you're authorizing the module as a master device in some of those bands, you would test it as a master device in those bands. If you're testing it as a client device in other bands, you would test it as a client device in those other bands as well. Can host manufacturers perform their own testing, or does testing need to be done by an accredited third-party lab? Excellent question. You may perform your own testing. However, you have to be sure that you are confident in the results. So if you have a nice setup in-house testing lab and you're confident in the results, then yes, absolutely. You can perform all of those spot check tests, keep all of the data on hand and everything like that. There's no problem with that. But if there are certain, you in-house, you might be able to do testing up to 1 gigahertz, but maybe you can't do testing, for example, over a gigahertz or something like that, in which case, you would probably have to find a lab at that point, but it does not have to be an accredited lab at that point. So it can be any lab, anyone in whose results you feel confident. Now, the potential risk that you take is, let's say you have an in-house lab and you do the testing and you say, oh, I bought a module, I put it in my host, I'm testing it, and everything is fine. Everything complies, not a problem at all. But maybe the testing wasn't done exactly to spec, or wasn't performed using the correct procedure, or maybe some of the equipment might have been out of calibration. And if the FCC goes in and ever tests it and they find something that's above the limit, then you could say, well, I tested it and it was below the limit, but they would say, well, are you confident in those results? And you'd have to say, well, no, it wasn't an accredited lab. So, that's the chance you're running. For the most part, most manufacturers are fairly comfortable doing a certain level of in-house testing. But again, it really depends on the specific capabilities of your in-house personnel and the equipment that you have available to you. Can host, okay, does the FCC or ISA Canada require you to also submit Part 15B unintentional emissions or unwanted emissions spot check data when filing SAR results? No. No, if you're doing a class 2 permissive change, if you've got if you're using a module, you bought a module that's approved as a mobile device, and you want to put it in your host, and it's a portable host, something that'll be used within 20 centimeters of the body, you would get the module manufacturer would perform a class 2 permissive change, and the SAR testing would be submitted with that class 2 permissive change. Again, the spot check testing is not submitted to the FCC. That is simply kept on file by you in case the FCC should ever request it. But you would not submit that even with part of a class 2 change for another aspect of the device. Considering host device integrating with full approved radio module during the host integration measurement, how much increase the fundamental field strength is expected? Well, hopefully there's none expected, but unfortunately, some oftentimes will occur. You got to be a little bit careful here, because when we're talking about output power levels, remember that the device is still always required to comply with whatever the output power level is on its grant. So, for example, 15247 limits the output power of a Bluetooth to 1 watt, but there's no modules operating 1 watt Bluetooths out there. And so your Bluetooth might be limited to 2 milliwatts, for example. When you plug it into your device and you measure it, and suddenly you're seeing an output of 10 milliwatts coming out of it for whatever reason, maybe on a radiated level like that, then that's a potential issue. That could mean that there's a problem with the module, that the module is already starting out overpowered, or it could be something about your particular host device that's causing this increase in a field strength. Now, 10 dB is a little extreme. I was, but a dB or 2 or something like that. So what I would highly recommend is that if the fundamental field strength level looks higher than what it was on the grant, that's something that you would definitely want to contact the module manufacturer about and work out with them the details to determine if it's something that needs to be addressed or not. If it comes down to being measurement error, for example, okay, then that's perhaps something that you can pretty much ignore and say, well, we can just show that it was a measurement error kind of thing or something like that. But again, without knowing the details, it's hard for me to give you a definitive answer, but I would highly recommend that in a case like that, you work with the module manufacturer. Does decrease of RF power during host integration require permissive change approval? Typically, yes. If you need to decrease the output power level, the FCC has stated that that is typically going to require a class 2 permissive change. And again, it would be for a specific host in that permissive change. But it is possible that that's not the case. And it might come down to the specific reason of why you're decreasing your RF output power. If you're decreasing it because when you put that module in your host device, the third harmonic shoots up, through the roof. So you have to decrease power to get that harmonic into place. In a case like that, I would say definitely a permissive change would be required. On the other hand, if you are going to reduce power because you want to save on battery life or something like that, then the amount you're reducing it by, it could be that could be handled as a class 1 permissive change by the module grantee. In other words, the module grantee should still be informed of it, but they might not have to submit that information to the FCC. It might be something that they then just keep in their own records and their own files. So the host manufacturer testing is recommended but not required. Yeah, it is actually, it is required. The FCC rules say recommended, but then the FCC has said if you choose not to do it, then there's a chance that they might call in a sample of your device. And so it's a kind of a de facto requirement. And if you actually look in the KDB publications, which are the FCC policy statements and documents that they put out, and again, that was at the end of the presentation. I had the links there. You will see that the spot check testing actually is required to at least ensure continuing compliance of the module. And then how can I get the presentation? Kim talked about that. She'll be sending that out. Most products are looking to sell in worldwide markets. How best to determine what's required worldwide? Good question. Typically, the United States has a certain amount of countries around the world that are MRA partners, mutual recognition agreement partners, with whom we do a lot of this type of work. So Canada, for example, the EU, UK, MIC in Japan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. We have, I can't remember if we have one with South Korea, I think also. So a lot of times, a CB, like ACB, the company I work for, we can issue an FCC grant, a Canadian grant for ISED. We can issue a type examination certificate for the EU and for UK and for Japan and Hong Kong. So we can cover those areas, for example, around the world. Other CBs exist, that can do those as well. Now, a lot of the rest of the world, that's not part of MRA agreements with the United States. And I'm thinking now about a lot of South America, Africa, the Indo-Pacific, places like that. Many of those, or most of those places, tend to rely either upon FCC authorization or EU authorization. So generally speaking, if you can get FCC certification for your device, and now remember, modules, you can't get a modular approval for the EU. The EU only authorizes final devices. I mean, you can get one, but it's not gonna, they can't leverage a certification like that. But generally speaking, once you have EU approval for a final device or an FCC certification, you can take those two and use them. Most of the other countries around the world will accept either the FCC authorization or the EU authorization. And again, ACB, we work not only those countries that I mentioned are the economies for which we can actually authorize certifications, but we have partners that can do international approvals for you anywhere in the world with a business partner that we work with. So we are certainly happy to work with you in obtaining whatever authorizations you need worldwide. And it's something you can contact us about, and we can work with you on that. So we'll be able to download the notes. I guess that's the presentation. Would a host device with an off-the-shelf USB Wi-Fi adapter plugged into it have any extra certification or labeling requirements? A USB Wi-Fi adapter is a very kind of special subset. It's not really a module, because a Wi-Fi, little USB Wi-Fi adapter is considered a final product or a finished device, whereas a module is not a finished device. And so as a result, because it's a finished device, you plug it into your device, you do not have to, as long as it can be seen on the device, you do not have to put the labeling on the outside of the device for it. Now, if you take a USB Wi-Fi adapter and you have it plugged in internally in your host device, so the end user would not be able to see it, in that case, you should put the labeling, this device contains TXFCC ID for that USB Wi-Fi adapter. Because again, if it's internally your device, then the end user, the bottom line is the FCC wants the end user to always be able to obtain the FCC ID number for any transmitter that they have. And so if the FCC ID number is on the Wi-Fi adapter as it's supposed to be, but that's inside your host device, the end user would not be able to see it. So in that case, you should, as I said, put the labeling on the outside. You make a full certification of a host with 2 integrated modules based on spot check. No. If you want to do a full certification of the host with the modules in there, it will require full testing. It will also require that you are able to obtain the confidential information for those modules. If you want to get a full certification that includes the modules, then you're going to have access to things like the schematics and block diagram and operational descriptions and tune-up procedures for those modules, because those are all required portions of the application for certification. So the whole point of the module is you don't have to do that if you leverage the module certification. But if you do want to reauthorize the module under your own, as part of your own product, you will have to work with the module manufacturer in that, because they are going to have to give you access to their proprietary information so that you can get that authorization for yourself. What's the criteria for determining if 2 certified modules are considered co-located? Once upon a time, no longer, but once upon a time when life was easier, the FCC used to say 20 centimeters or closer was considered co-located. Since then, they have backtracked on that, and I guess they didn't like providing anything that specific, which is unfortunate, because certainly on our end of things, having that kind of specificity is very useful. But now what the FCC says is you have to use engineering judgment. Co-location, it might be worth the spot check, even if it's more than 20 centimeters, depending on the output power level of the modules. It might still be worth doing spot check testing with the 2 of them operating simultaneously in order to make sure that there's no interference. As a matter of fact, really, no matter how many transmitters you have in your module and no matter how close they are to one another, when you're performing your spot check measurements, you should have all transmitters on and running, regardless of how close they are to one another, because in the end, that way you will be able to say that your final product, your host device with multiple transmitters in it, continues to comply even when all transmitters are simultaneously transmitting. So in the end, it's not so important about the specific distance, but rather that you're just ensuring that your device is compliant when everything inside of it is transmitting at the same time. Secondly, what kind of exhibit can claim that most module conducted test results be reused or unchanged? What kind of exhibit can claim that most module conducted test results to be reused or unchanged and be reused for certification? Okay, now, again, I think this is talking about certifying the device in your device. And so the FCC does have requirements or a policy regarding data reuse. And so if you wanted to take some certified modules, put them in your host device, and then reauthorize your host device to include those modules so that now you're responsible for everything in there, there is a very good chance that you will be able to leverage a fair amount of the data from the module. You would have to follow the FCC's policy for data reuse. And in that policy, it also does require spot check testing as well. So there is a possibility to perform spot check testing and to do some data reuse, but you would have to follow the specific policy that the FCC spells out for that. That's one of the KDB publications, and you could search on data reuse for that particular KDB publication. And that will tell you exactly what data can be reused, what data cannot be reused, and the procedure that you go through in doing so. And this looks like it might be the last one. Approved radio module integrated into e-bike. Does e-bike require radio integration test as well? Yes. Again, any host device, regardless of what that host device is, if you put a radio module into it, you have to perform that spot check testing. Now, an e-bike is considered a transportation vehicle. And so any digital circuitry on your e-bike is exempt from authorization requirements, because digital circuitry that's used exclusively in some type of automotive device, doesn't have to be powered. It can be a car, it can be a bike, a motorcycle, an e-bike, anything like that. The digital circuitry in your e-bike is exempt from authorization requirements. But if you're using a certified module, you will still have to perform the spot check testing with the module installed in the e-bike to ensure that the module remains compliant. And actually, I think that would be pretty important because, you know, a bike, that's a lot of metal. You know, that's a big kind of hunky antenna that you're attaching that module to potentially. And so you definitely want to make sure that when the module is attached to the bike, that the module continues to operate compliantly. I think that's all the questions that we have here.
Thank you, Greg. And if somehow we didn't get to your questions or you have questions at the end of this webinar, I did just put in the chat where you can email your questions. I do receive them, and then I will forward it to the presenter, in this case, Greg, and I would get those questions sent to him, and he will respond as he can. Again, thanks goes to Greg for taking time out to enlighten us about modular approvals. We are currently working on our 2025 lineup of free webinars. So if you haven't already done so, please make sure you visit our website to subscribe to our Washington Labs Academy to receive updates. This is easily done by visiting www.wll.com. You're going to click on the training tab in the upper right corner and fill in your information where you see sign up for updates. So again, on behalf of the Washington Labs Academy, we would like to thank you all for attending. I will now end this event. I will hold on for a little while for those who need to capture the email where they can send additional questions. And again, thank you, Greg.
All right. Thank you all. Take care. Have a great day.
You too.